For 600 years, one family ruled an empire that stretched across 3 continents. They built palaces that shimmered along the Bosphorus, their marble floors reflecting chandeliers imported from Venice and Vienna. They held the title of Caliph, the supreme spiritual authority over the entire Sunni Muslim world. 36 sultans sat on that throne, one after another, an unbroken line stretching back to 1299. At its height, this dynasty commanded armies that made European kings tremble in their own capitals. And then, in a single night, all of it was gone. Not stripped away over years, not lost in a slow, negotiated decline. Erased in 24 hours. They were stripped of their citizenship, stripped of their property, stripped of the right to ever set foot in their own homeland again. 156 members of a 6th century dynasty were woken before sunrise, handed a single suitcase and a few £100 in cash. Marched onto a train leaving a city their ancestors had ruled for nearly 500 years. They would never be allowed back. Princes who had spent their lives training for military command became stateless refugees overnight. Women who had never once touched money in their lives were, within a few short years, scrubbing floors in hotel kitchens just to eat. This is one of the most brutal falls from power in modern history, and almost nobody talks about it. So let's go back to March of 1924 and walk through the 24 hours that ended 600 years of Ottoman rule. To understand why an entire dynasty could be erased in a single night, you have to understand how far it had already fallen. By the mid-1800s, European diplomats had already given the Ottoman Empire a nickname dripping with contempt: the sick man of Europe. It was not a metaphor, it was a diagnosis. Russia was chipping away at Ottoman land in the north. Greece had won its independence. Serbia, Romania, and Bulgaria had torn themselves free. An empire that had once besieged Vienna twice was now being outpaced, outgunned, and outmaneuvered by industrial armies it could no longer match. The sultans tried to save it. Sultan Abdulhamid II spent 33 years playing European powers against each other, modernizing what he could, clinging to the caliphate as the last unifying thread holding together a crumbling, multi-ethnic empire. It bought time, it did not buy survival. In 1908, a group calling itself the Committee of Union and Progress, the Young Turks, forced a constitutional revolution. A year later they deposed Abdulhamid entirely and installed a ceremonial sultan in his place. The men now running the empire believed nationalism and modernization could resurrect it. Instead, their ambition placed the empire at a card table it could not afford to sit at. In 1914, the committee made the single most catastrophic gamble in Ottoman history. They entered the First World War on the side of Germany and Austria-Hungary, betting that a Central Powers victory would restore Ottoman territory and prestige. It was not a calculated risk. It was a desperate roll of the dice by men who had already lost almost everything else. The empire bled out. British forces swept through Mesopotamia and Palestine. The Arab revolt, quietly armed and encouraged by British intelligence, tore away Ottoman control of the Arabian Peninsula piece by piece. By October 1918, there was nothing left to negotiate with. The Armistice of Mudros surrendered what remained of Ottoman military power to the Allies. When the war ended, foreign soldiers patrolled the streets of Istanbul. British, French and Italian flags flew over a city that had been the seat of Ottoman power for nearly 5 centuries. The Sultan of the moment, Mehmed VI, still sat inside Dolmabahce Palace. He still held the title of Caliph. He still believed the dynasty could somehow survive the wreckage. He was wrong, and the man who would prove it was already organizing an army in the hills of Anatolia. His name was Mustafa Kemal, and he had no interest in preserving anyone's throne. Kemal rejected the humiliating Treaty of Sèvres, which the Allies had imposed in 1920, and which would have carved Anatolia into foreign pieces. He built a nationalist movement from almost nothing. By 1922, his forces had driven the Greek army out of western Anatolia and pushed back the French and Italians, effectively securing the borders of a nation that did not yet legally exist. The irony was brutal. The one genuine Ottoman military success of the entire war, the defence at Gallipoli in 1915, had been engineered largely by a young, brilliant commander named Mustafa Kemal. The empire's last great victory had produced the very man who would go on to bury it. But Kemal did not simply want independence, he wanted a republic. A secular nation with no room for a 600-year-old dynasty sitting on a throne above it. On the 1st of November 1922, the Grand National Assembly voted to abolish the Ottoman Sultanate entirely. Some deputies hesitated. They understood the weight of what they were ending. Kemal did not tolerate hesitation. He stood before the assembly and made it clear this was not a debate. Sultan Mehmed VI, suddenly a private citizen inside his own palace, was now being quietly discussed as a candidate for a treason trial. On the night of the 17th of November 1922, he escaped Istanbul in a British military ambulance, personally escorted aboard the battleship HMS Malaya by a British general. He sailed away from the city his family had ruled for 469 years. He reportedly said his greatest sorrow was leaving his homeland behind. He never saw it again. But the abolition of the Sultanate was not the end of the family. It was only the opening move. Because Kemal had left one institution standing, a ceremonial, powerless shell of the old order. And in March of 1924, he decided that shell had to be destroyed too, along with everyone who carried its blood. That decision would unfold in a single night. And it is the most devastating 24 hours in the history of the Ottoman dynasty. To understand how brutal this moment truly was, you need to meet the man left holding a title with nothing behind it. After abolishing the Sultanate, Kemal had allowed one Ottoman institution to survive, the Caliphate, now purely ceremonial. A cousin of the exiled Sultan, a cultured gentleman named Abdulmecid II, was appointed to the role. He was a painter whose work had been exhibited in Vienna, a pianist, a polyglot fluent in French, German, English, Turkish, Arabic, and Persian. He held weekly Friday processions through Istanbul, greeting crowds with quiet dignity. By early 1924, those crowds had thinned to almost nothing. On one of his final public appearances, more American tourists showed up to watch the spectacle than actual Muslim worshippers came to pray. He knew what was coming. He wrote to the government requesting a modest increase to his allowance. Kemal's response was brutally dismissive. He told the Caliph, in essence, that his office was a historical relic with no justification for continuing to exist. Then came the 3rd of March 1924. Inside the Grand National Assembly in Ankara, a session opened that would last only hours, but would end 6 centuries of dynastic history. The deputies voted. The caliphate would be abolished, effective immediately. Every single member of the Ottoman family, not just the caliph, not just the former sultan, every descendant, every cousin, every child born into that bloodline, would be stripped of Turkish citizenship, expelled from the country, and have every asset they owned confiscated by the state. The law technically gave them 3 days to prepare. Abdulmecid II did not get 3 days. He did not get 3 hours of peace. Before dawn broke, on March 4th, soldiers arrived at his residence and told him to pack. Now, picture the scene inside that house in the black hours before sunrise. A man who had spent his life reading French poetry and practicing Chopin on a grand piano, suddenly surrounded by government officials telling him his entire existence in this country was over, effective before breakfast. His wives, his children, servants who had known no other life, all of them scrambling through rooms full of decades of accumulated history, trying to decide in minutes what 600 years of a dynasty could be reduced to inside a single suitcase. Most of them packed almost nothing, not because they didn't understand the danger, but because deep down they refused to believe it was permanent. Surely, they told themselves, this is temporary. Surely the Turkish people will want us back within a few months. Surely this will blow over. It would not blow over for 30 years. For some of them, it would not blow over for 50. The government did not even allow the caliph to be seen leaving from Istanbul's main railway station, Sirkeci, fearing the sight of his deportation might spark public demonstrations. Instead, before the sun had fully risen, he and his family were rushed to a smaller, quieter station at Satalka, far from the crowds who might have objected. As the train prepared to leave, One final small human gesture cut through the cruelty of the morning. The station director, a Jewish man with no obligation to show any respect to a deposed Muslim caliph, was the last person in Turkey to formally acknowledge him with dignity before the train pulled away. That train carried away not just a title, it carried away an entire world. 156 people were officially listed for expulsion that week, but the true number was far higher, once you count the servants who refused to abandon the families they had served their entire lives, and the children who had no say in any of it. These were people who had never left the walls of a palace. Many had never handled a banknote. Many had never cooked a single meal for themselves. They had spent their lives being trained in poetry, calligraphy, music, and imperial protocol, an education perfectly suited to a world that by that morning no longer existed. Each family was handed 1,000 Turkish lira on the way out the door. It sounded like a sum of money. In practice, it barely covered the cost of the journey, and perhaps a single month of modest living. It was not compensation, it was closer to bus fare out of their own history. By the end of that 24-hour window, the House of Osman, a dynasty founded in 1299 by a tribal chieftain in northwestern Anatolia, no longer legally existed inside the country it had built. 600 years, undone before lunchtime. And the true horror of that night was not the paperwork. It was what came next, because none of them had any idea what surviving as a stateless, penniless royal family in 1920s Europe would actually require of them. Nothing had prepared the Ottoman family for what exile actually meant. Their travel documents, issued at the border, expired after a single year. Since they were no longer Turkish citizens, there was no way to renew them. By 1925, most of the family was effectively stateless, unable to legally work in most of the countries they had fled to, unable to travel freely, trapped wherever the wind had blown them. Prince Ali Vassib eventually managed to negotiate courtesy passports from the French government. France granted them movement. France never granted them citizenship. A bitter irony, given that centuries earlier, Suleiman the Magnificent himself had once personally rescued a French king from captivity. The financial collapse was total. These were people who had grown up donating to charity, not receiving it. The princes had been trained in military command and imperial governance, skills with zero market value in the civilian economies of 1920s Europe. The women, many of whom had literally never left palace grounds before the exile, were thrown into complete independence overnight with no preparation whatsoever. So they sold what they had left. Jewellery went first, and it went for a fraction of its worth. Because they had no idea what any of it was actually worth, and because the dealers buying it knew exactly how desperate they were. When the jewellery ran out, the real suffering began. There are documented accounts, not rumours, documented accounts of members of a 600-year royal dynasty washing dishes in hotel kitchens, begging on street corners, and searching through garbage for food. Some of them died of hunger. A trustee had been assigned to liquidate the family's remaining property back in Turkey and send them the proceeds. He sold everything as instructed. Then he kept the money for himself. And Ankara did not simply exile the family and move on. The new government watched them, even from 1,000 miles away. When family members married foreigners, Ankara reacted with open suspicion. When a handful of exiles began publishing anti-Turkish newspapers from Greece, Turkish officials pressured Greek authorities until the papers were shut down. Europe in the 1920s and 1930s had its own catastrophes to worry about. A continent still recovering from one world war, sliding toward another, buried in its own economic collapse. A displaced Ottoman royal family made for an interesting newspaper headline now and then. It was a curiosity, not a cause. Sympathy rarely translated into anything that actually put food on the table. Some help did arrive, from unexpected corners of the Muslim world. The Nizam of Hyderabad sent money. So did the Egyptian prince Omar Tassoun and King Hussein of the Hejaz. But the family was so widely scattered, Nice, Beirut, Cairo, Damascus, a handful of European capitals, that much of that assistance never reached the people who needed it most. And some of the exiled family were simply too proud to accept charity at all, no matter how badly they needed it. One prince, Tevfik Effendi, was a genuinely gifted concert pianist. He was also painfully, crushingly shy, so shy that he could only ever perform from behind a curtain, hidden from the audience he was playing for. It was a small, strange, human detail buried inside an enormous tragedy. A man with real talent, completely useless to him in a world that no longer cared what a deposed prince could do with his hands. Mehmed VI, the exiled sultan, settled in a modest villa in San Remo, Italy. King Victor Emmanuel III personally offered him a palace to live in and a steady income. The sultan refused. As an Islamic leader, he considered it beneath his dignity to accept charity from a non-Muslim sovereign. He chose poverty over what he saw as a compromise of everything he still represented. He kept one imperial signet ring and a heavy gold necklace passed down through generations of his family, refusing to sell either one. Even as his bank account sat frozen and his fortune, which had never really been his personal fortune, but the state's, simply ceased to exist. He died in that borrowed villa on the 16th of May 1926, at the age of 65. When his belongings were searched afterward, a man who had once commanded an empire spanning 3 continents was found to own almost nothing at all. He was buried in Damascus, far from the imperial tombs of Istanbul, where 4 centuries of his ancestors were laid to rest. Abdulmecid II, the exiled caliph, fared slightly better thanks to one crucial family alliance. His daughter married into the family of the Nizam of Hyderabad, at the time considered one of the richest men alive, who quietly arranged financial support across British colonial channels. Abdulmecid spent his remaining years painting, playing piano in the afternoons, attending Friday prayers at the Grand Mosque of Paris, and writing memoirs that eventually stretched across 12 volumes. He died of a heart attack in his Paris villa on the 23rd of August 1944, during the Allied liberation of the city, as stray gunfire from the street fighting reportedly struck near his home. The last Caliph of Islam died amid the sound of a different empire's liberation. His family requested his body be sent home to Istanbul. Turkey refused. His body sat in a Paris mosque mortuary for nearly a decade. Before he was finally buried in Medina, Saudi Arabia, the city where the Caliphate itself had been born 13 centuries earlier, a place he had never once set foot in during his life. Not every story ended in ruin. Princess Nesli Shah Sultan, granddaughter of both the last Sultan and the last Caliph, grew up in poverty in Nice before marrying into the Egyptian royal family, only to watch that monarchy collapse as well in 1952, the second dynasty to fall out from under her in a single lifetime. Prince Osman Fuad, a former military commander and one-time president of the football club Fenerbahce, lived out his life in Nice, buried in a Paris cemetery instead of the imperial tombs his bloodline had earned. One prince's own father led a failed uprising among Uyghurs in western China, only to be found dead in a New York hotel room in 1935 under circumstances nobody has ever fully explained. The exile did not end quietly, and it did not end quickly. In 1952, 28 years after that single night, in March, the Turkish government finally allowed the women of the dynasty to come home. The men waited even longer. It was not until 1974, a full half-century after the banishment, that male descendants of the Ottoman family were permitted to legally set foot in Turkey again. By then, almost everyone who had actually lived through that night in 1924 was already dead. The consequences of that single night did not stay contained inside one family's tragedy. They reshaped an entire region, and they are still shaping it today. When the Ottoman state collapsed, Britain and France carved up its former Arab territories through the Sykes-Picot Agreement and the League of Nations mandate system. France took Syria and Lebanon, Britain took Iraq, Palestine, and Transjordan, borders drawn by European diplomats with little regard for the tribal, ethnic, and religious realities on the ground, became the framework for conflicts that are still burning today. The abolition of the caliphate left an even deeper scar. For 13 centuries, some form of caliphate had existed as a unifying spiritual institution across the Islamic world. When Kemal erased it in 1924, He didn't just end a title, he opened a vacuum that has never been fully filled. The idea of restoring a caliphate has resurfaced again and again in the decades since, sometimes peacefully, and sometimes violently. It became central to the ideology of groups like ISIS nearly a century later. The ghost of the institution Kemal destroyed in a single night is still haunting global politics today. There is also, strangely, a cultural afterlife nobody in 1924 could have predicted. For decades, the Turkish Republic treated the Ottoman era as something to be quietly ashamed of. A backward, decadent monarchy, rightfully replaced by a modern secular state. Ottoman history was downplayed in schools. Ottoman artifacts sat neglected. But in the last 2 decades, that shame has quietly flipped into fascination. Turkish television dramas about the Ottoman era, like Magnificent Century, became massive hits, not just in Turkey, but across the Middle East and far beyond it. An empire that had been erased from its own national story for half a century was suddenly being binge-watched by millions. And the family itself? Today, the Osmanoğlu family, the surname they adopted, Lusa, meaning son of Osman, after the dynasty's founder, numbers several dozen living descendants scattered across Turkey, Europe, the United States, and the Middle East. Some work in business, some in academia, some in the arts. In 2006, family members gathered inside Dolmabahce Palace for the presentation of a documentary about their own exile. Many of them stepping inside the palace their ancestors had ruled from for the very first time in their lives. In the very building their family had once been thrown out of and told never to return to. They have no political power, no claim to any throne. They are ordinary citizens of a republic that once erased them by law, carrying an extraordinary surname and very little else. The last man to hold the ceremonial headship of the family, Dündar Abdülkerim Osmanoğlu, died in Damascus in 2021 at the age of 90. He had been born in exile in Syria, in the same year his parents were expelled from Turkey. He lived his entire life in Damascus, and never once managed to return to the homeland of his ancestors. The Syrian civil war made it impossible in his final years. He died in the country of his exile, having never set foot in the empire his family once ruled. There is something almost unbearably human buried underneath all of this history. It is a story about what happens when power isn't just lost, it's actively, deliberately, systematically stripped away. About people who went from commanding millions to searching through trash for food. About holding on to your dignity when everything that ever defined you has been taken from you overnight. The Romanovs were executed. The Habsburgs lost an empire, but kept much of their wealth. The Qing dynasty fell, and China eventually made peace with its imperial past. The Ottomans were erased from their own nation's story, entirely, exiled, impoverished, forgotten, only to slowly, quietly re-emerge decades later as the world began reckoning with everything that had been lost in that single night in March. So, here's the question I want you to sit with for a second. If your entire world could be taken from you in 24 hours, no warning, no negotiation, just gone, what is the one thing you would refuse to give up, no matter how desperate things got? Drop that answer below in one word. Just one word. I want to see what people actually choose when everything else is stripped away. If this story hit you the way it hit me, hit subscribe. It genuinely helps this channel keep telling stories history quietly tried to erase. I'll see you in the next one.